Thank you for joining us for our Grief Sensitivity Virtual Learning Institute. This is the second part of a two-part series. The first part of the series was September 10th and 11th. The focus of this institute is on supporting those individuals experiencing grief and loss during COVID-19 and beyond. We are so glad to have you here with us today. Next slide, please. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Dr. Mindy Chadwell, and I'm a faculty trainer for the Mid-America Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. I am pleased to be your host for this session, and I'm excited to introduce the session entitled Beyond Sorry for Your Loss, Supporting Students in Their Grief Recovery, Part 2. I want to thank our wonderful speakers, Rosalind Kwong, Alejandra Torres, and Vania Duran for being here with us today. And a big thank you to all of you for joining us. We truly hope you find today's presentation engaging and helpful in your work. Next slide, please. Okay, to start off, I would like to cover just a few housekeeping items. We have made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up using your registration information. All attendees are muted for today's presentation and cannot share video. If you have a question for the presenter, please use the Q&A pod and you can enter your question there. If you have a comment or a link for all attendees, please go ahead and use the chat box feature. The session recording and slide deck will be posted on our website within about 2 weeks. If you attend at least half of the session, you will receive an email following the presentation on how to access a certificate of attendance. This event is captioned, so to view captions, click the arrow beside the CC box at the bottom of your screen and choose Show Subtitles. To change the size of the subtitles, click the arrow next to the CC box and choose Subtitle Settings. And that's where you'll find the option to make the subtitles smaller or larger. And if you don't already, please follow us on social media and stay in touch with us. Next slide, please. We recently released a series of fact sheets focused on addressing various grief-related topics, including defining grief, responses to grief across the lifespan, preventive strategies and protective factors, cultural responsiveness, and evidence-based treatments. You can check those out on our Responding to COVID-19 Grief, Loss, and Bereavement webpage, as well as additional information for more MHTTC events and resources. Next slide. We do want to recognize that participating in this and our other sessions may activate your own grief and feelings of loss. As mental health care providers and school mental health professionals, we also need to take care of ourselves. Please monitor yourself and practice good self-care, which might mean taking breaks, stretching, drinking plenty of fluids, and practicing mindfulness or whatever helps you in staying centered and grounded. If needed, here are the links to helplines and hotlines. These are also listed on the Learning Institute website. Next slide, please. Our SAMHSA-funded MHTTC network focuses on technology transfer, which means the adoption and implementation of evidence-based practices for mental health across the United States and territories. We develop and disseminate resources and provide free local and regional training and technical assistance for the mental health workforce. Next slide. And here is our lovely map displaying the centers that make up the MHTTC network. We have 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. Please visit our website and find your center so you may stay up to date on trainings and resources offered in your region. Next slide. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in the presentation are the views of our speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. Next slide. Okay, let's get started. We have amazing presenters for this session today. Next slide, please. We have Rosalind Kwong with us, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist and is currently the clinical trainer and evidence-based practice coordinator at Hathaway Sycamores Child and Family Services, a multi-service agency which provides services to children, youth, young adults, and adults in the Los Angeles County. Rosalind holds multiple certifications to provide treatment, supervision, or training in different evidence-based practices, including trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, seeking safety, positive parenting program, managing and adapting practices, and parent-child interaction therapy for children who have experienced trauma. She also has completed many trainings specifically in the topic of grief treatment, including childhood traumatic grief treatment, a model using TFCBT to treat childhood traumatic grief. We also have Alejandra Torres, who is a bilingual licensed marriage and family therapist from Los Angeles, California. Alejandra works for Hathaway Sycamores, providing services for school-aged children and their families. Alejandra specializes in trauma and the treatment of young children from birth to 5, dealing with a range of experiences, including domestic violence, abuse, and grief. And we are also so pleased to welcome Vania Duran, who is a clinician for Hathaway Sycamores in Covina, working with children and families. She got her Bachelor of Science in Cognitive Science with emphasis in clinical aspects of cognition at UCSD and her Master of Social Work at USC. Vania also has experience working with children and adults with developmental disabilities, as well as adults with serious mental illness. Rosalind, Alejandra, and Vania, thank you for being with us today. I will pass it off to you.
Thank you, Mindy. As in every time, I feel really, really honored to be a part of this institute. My name is Rosalind Kwong, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm currently the clinical trainer and evidence-based practice coordinator at Hathaway Sycamores. I'm so excited that I have as my co-presenters Alejandra Torres and Vania Duran with me. They're both clinicians at our agency. And it's really exciting to see many of you, including some of you that are coming back and from the last time that we've seen each other. Next slide, please. We are from Hathaway Sycamores Child and Family Services. The agency currently provides services to children, youth, young adults, and adults across 7 of the 8 service areas throughout the Los Angeles County here in California. With services including residential treatment program, transitional living, foster adoption services, community-based mental health services, and our largest program, it's actually school-based services, where we have mental health providers on school campuses providing services to students and families. Our mission is cultivating hope and resilience to enrich the well-being of children, adults, families, and communities. Next slide, please. We are very privileged today to be focusing once again on moving beyond the commonly used phrase, sorry for your loss. By the end of our time today, we're hopeful that you will be able to describe the common barriers in communicating empathy to students who are grieving, identify your own barriers, and be able to find ways to overcome them. You will also be able to walk away with some therapeutic activities and ideas to support students on their grief journey. Next slide, please. Our ideas for today's presentation on how to support students on their grief journey are based on some core concepts about grief that we discussed back in September in part 1. We want to do a quick recap for you. We believe that grief is a process, and instead of thinking that grief as a condition to be fixed, we look at grief as a natural response to loss and are really setting out to support those who are grieving in their grieving journey. And we agreed that grief is exacerbated during COVID as well. And hold on, sorry. Thank you. Let's see. We also spoke about how and why communicating empathy is important. And while we believe that there are general grief indicators that may be linked to developmental stages, we see everyone's experience of grief as unique. And we consider how supporting a student on their grief journey includes 4 aspects. And click, please. Including establishing a sense of safety, dealing with emotions, making sense of the loss, and living with the loss beyond the loss. We would like to start out with a quick poll at this time. And the question is, since the last time we met in September, have you had to support students on their grief journey? And if yes, how many? I just want you to know, if you were unable to be with us back in part 1, please just answer based on maybe how many students who have experienced losses you have worked with since September. So I'll give you a moment just to put in your numbers so that we can take a look at where everybody's at. Great. So it looks like that some of us, about 50% of us actually had worked with students who have experienced some losses from 1 to 3 students. So that's actually our highest percentage. And as you can see too, we have about 35% that hasn't had that happen. My team sometimes talk about how if you haven't really had to work with someone that has experienced a loss during this period of time, probably it won't surprise us that within maybe the next few months that you may actually end up seeing more people. But it looks like that more than half of us among here that has put in your vote has had some experiences in the past few months in working with someone that has experienced a loss. Thank you so much for participating in that poll. Next slide, please. We have established last time that it is extremely important to be able to communicate empathy. And when we're trying to support someone who is grieving, it's just like so important. When trying to look for symbols to capture the idea of what empathy is, the first one I found, it's on the lower right corner of your slide right now. And then I realized that this is really not what we're talking about when we're saying empathy. Because when I think about it, I realize that you do not have to feel exactly the same way. So that equal sign right there, you don't have to in order to really communicate empathy and experience empathy for the other person. You don't have to feel exactly the same way, and you don't really need to have experienced the same thing either, because a lot of us may be experiencing different losses. Click, please. So instead, it involves being able to hold someone's heart and feelings. So this was a symbol that I felt like can better capture it. It involves giving permission and validating how they're feeling. It involves using a discovery approach. And like the little girl that's in that picture, looking at the boy's owie. Let me see where it hurts, and let me have you show me how bad it hurts while I have my arm around you. It also involves communicating that I'm on this journey with you, like this cat right there that's sitting in the thunderstorm with this person. And sometimes there are no words that are being exchanged in that process. Next slide, please. So what are some common barriers in empathetic communications? This is actually based on the work of Elizabeth Morrison, licensed clinical social worker. But we're just looking at this a little bit more from a grief angle, if you will. Very often, I've heard of providers saying, I don't know how to, or what if I say the wrong thing? Sometimes the question is, what if they cry? And of course, with like a little extension of the question being, if they cry, what do I do then? Just like communication is a skill, communicating empathy, it's also a skill that we can practice. And so I'll categorize that barrier as a lack of skills. Another common barrier involves the time that it takes to be on the grief journey with someone. I don't have time for this, or what if they cry once again? And then the extended question is, how do I keep the conversation short with thinking about the limitation in time that I have? And so I will categorize that as insufficient time. Another common barrier involves the time that it takes to if communicating empathy involves us being present for the person that's grieving, then sometimes our thoughts, our feelings may really come as a distraction. What about judgment or biases or our own beliefs about grief and loss? Those may get into the way as well. And so I may be having too many thoughts and feelings. It's hard for me to stay present. And what if they cry? What if they do this? What if they do that? I'm going to categorize that as internal distraction or judgment. I often describe grief as a plate of spaghetti where one strand easily touches another strand. And the truth is, some aspects about one loss may be really touching another strand. And so it becomes really overwhelming at times. Sometimes our own grief for our losses actually gets in the way of us being able to communicate empathy to the other person as well. And I'm going to categorize that as our own grief. Next slide, please. So now I want to invite you to enter into a brief reflective space with me. Answering some of these questions may help us in zeroing in on what may be your biggest barrier. I invite you to consider your own responses to these questions listed here. And please don't feel obligated to share a response necessarily, but use this time to really think. The question that I'm posing, the first one is, how confident do I feel about my own ability to empathize? And do I constantly feel like I'm rushing from one thing to the next? What is getting in the way of me being present for the student? And have I honored my own grieving process? Is it possible that it is getting in the way? So I'm going to give you a little bit of time, maybe 30 seconds to think through this really quickly. It's a time to kind of look inside yourself and see where your own barriers may be. If you can click, please. The answers that you're thinking through for these questions may point you to an area where your barriers may be. So I want us to do a very quick poll right now. So if we can launch the poll, please. We would like to ask you, in what category would you think is the biggest barrier for you? Is it a lack of skills or not having enough time, having internal distractions, or maybe your own grief? And Dave, I definitely agree with you that sometimes we feel like we are so rushed because there's so much paperwork. And if being able to be on this journey with someone, a lot of times it involves time. So we'll think a little bit about what may be things that we can do to overcome these barriers. So I'll give you a moment to answer that. Great. So yes, it seems like that 35% of us think that it's insufficient time. A lot of time that may be the biggest barrier. Thank you for your vulnerability in terms of maybe not feeling very confident, not having the skills to do it. I'm also seeing that maybe internal distraction as well sometimes will get in the way. And now I want to invite someone from our team to share about their experience. We'll start with Vanya. Vanya Duran is a clinician from our Covina site, and she is an associate clinical social worker. She'll be sharing about her own barriers and how she overcame them. Next slide, please. And Vanya, we would love to hear from you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Vanya. Thank you for joining us. I wanted to talk about what my barriers were and how I overcame them. And I really ran into two barriers that had to do with my own grief. One was my own loss in my life, and another is collective grief, things that are going on in the world. So for example, I had my own loss, and I had written this poem to commemorate the first year, the anniversary of my grandmother's death. I noticed that I was feeling slower. I noticed that my body was just very different when the first year hit. So I wrote this poem, and it really helped me. And that helped me when I was working with the clients when they were talking about their own losses. So I'm going to go ahead and read from the poem. It's called The First Year. The month begins, and I start to feel a tightness in the air around me. My movements lag. I slump. But this month doesn't mean anything. What is time, really? It means nothing, and I'm okay. The days start to pass, and I see the first year fast approaching, but I'm moving slower now. My OCD acts up like fire that found a nest of dead foliage. I bet when the first year comes, it will be just like last month. What's the difference? It won't mean anything, and I'll be fine. It's a few years before the first year, or a few days before the first year. It's not the first year, but it's the day that we knew the end was coming. I drove home from work, but I can't get out of my car. I stay parked for half an hour. I'm staring forward. I feel empty. Why does this mean something? The first year is here, and I avoid all thoughts of it being the first year. You see, it's just like any other day, just as I've been telling myself. I had nothing to fear, nothing. Day one after the first year, and the exhaustion of pretending has caught up with me. I cry, I mourn, and I miss you. So this poem really helped me with the feelings that I was feeling, like I was really trying to put a block to my feelings. And here I really let myself feel it so that when I'm able to work with the clients, I didn't feel as triggered by when they were talking about their own experiences. Thank you. And then on the right-hand side, you can see I made nicho. So this is a video from the photo. And this is Breonna Taylor because I was really affected by what has been going on in the world with Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, with so many others. And those were topics that did come up in session. I wasn't the only one being affected by it. I wasn't the only one feeling anger, feeling sadness, crying about it. But I did find myself wanting to cry in session while the clients were talking about their experiences. Part of it was being touched by how they were moved by it, and then the other was my own processing with it. So what I did with that was I made this nicho, I made this shadow box. I did a painting of George Floyd. I did a lot of art surrounding it, along with doing my own thinking about what I can do. And that was helpful because when I was able to talk to the clients, then I didn't feel like I was holding back tears or holding back rage when they were expressing their own feelings as well. And that's really how I overcame my barriers, was really taking the time to honor it, taking the time to look it in the face, and accepting it. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Vanya. I hope you can read some of the comments there too on the chat. I think a lot of people are definitely touched by it. Now I want to introduce Alejandra Torres, a licensed marriage and family therapist. She's a school-based clinician for our school-based program. So Alejandra, if you can share your experience with us.
Hi, everybody. I echo a lot of what we shared earlier about being able to overcome the barrier when we don't know how to communicate empathy. That was probably one of my biggest ones. It was a lot of overthinking how to communicate empathy for someone when they're on their grief journey. Questions came up like, will I say the right thing? How is it going to land? It can be difficult enough in person to communicate these things. And then now with the shift, with some of us providing services exclusively through telehealth, it's only added to the load. I listed right here this book, The Rabbit Listened, because for me, it has been a great example of just the simplicity and the efficacy of being present and just listening to the other person's experience. Sometimes we want to share words to alleviate the pain, but it can be just as impactful to just say, I hear you, or to even be there and to reflect on the emotional experience, however it looks. Sometimes our instinct may be to soothe, especially when we work with children or offer other words for encouragement, but we really don't have to overthink it. By not avoiding the grief discussion and offering a safe therapeutic space to really process the reaction, we're modeling for our clients and their families that it is okay to talk about grief and death. So with this book, for those of us who haven't read it, I noticed a lot of people were talking about it. This is The Rabbit Listen by Corey Doerfeld. Taylor, the young child in this book, builds a giant structure with wooden blocks and is very proud of what they built. And then all of a sudden, the structure gets destroyed unexpectedly. The story follows examples of different animals coming and talking to Taylor to try to process what just happened, ranging from the chicken clucking and insisting that Taylor talk about it. The bear tells Taylor to growl and be angry about it. The elephant just wants to fix it all for Taylor, and the snake wants to get even with someone else about it. The ostrich wants to hide and pretend it didn't happen as well. And then Taylor comes across the rabbit, and as we can see, it seems like the rabbit is the perfect person or the perfect symbol there for Taylor. The rabbit just listens as Taylor details exactly what happened, the emotions, and is just present and provides that comfort that Taylor needed in the moment. These different examples in the book really highlighted for me the role we play in providing treatment, as I'm sure there's been plenty of different examples of people having different reactions like those animals listed, and how we can be just like the rabbit and just be there and listen. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Alejandra. I'm really hopeful that you have found some ideas from Vania's and Alejandra's sharing. We'll be hearing from them a little bit more later too as we go into some of the inaction steps. In addition, here's just some ideas for the 4 specific categories that we touched on earlier. If you find that your biggest barrier is surrounding the lack of skills, then I want to invite you to really think through how you may be able to learn and practice the skills more. Being here at the Institute is definitely such a big step. Some of the skills that we would suggest starting with will include nonverbal and verbal ways to communicate empathy and expressing that I'm on this journey with you. It may be just the way that we can lean in, the way that we can verbalize when we see nonverbal cues. Reflective listening and reflective statements. Things like, it sounds like you miss being able to run to your person when you're feeling sad. Open-ended questions. What are some of the things that you miss the most about your person? What would you like to say to your person if they were still here? Acknowledging. It would be, I acknowledge that this must be so hard for you. These are some starting points in terms of skills, but thinking about one of the questions from the Q&A from part 1, I really want to just say that it's important to be mindful, but don't be paralyzed by the fear of saying the wrong thing. There are tons of things out there on Instagram or online about what not to say. While it's helpful to get yourself familiarized with some of the common things to avoid, at the end of the day, I still see students as really resilient. And I'm sure my team would agree with me that although they may be really hurting, I found them to be the most forgiving people when something wrong, and I quote, was said. It comes back to whether you have the attitude and the relationship with them to be able to come back and say, I wonder what it was like for you when I said that. And I'm really sorry that you experienced that as insensitive. And I want you to know I want to be different, but I'm still learning. What can I do to change that? And I remember that last time back in September when I walked out of some of the other workshops, I really felt like there's so much more for me, myself, to learn as well. And so I'm on this learning journey with you. If your biggest barrier is not having enough time, ask yourself, what are some ways that I can slow down and honor the grieving process? Is there a way that maybe I can schedule the time with this particular student, maybe at a time when I may not be rushing to the next appointment, possibly toward the end of the day, or maybe in the morning or before recess? If internal distraction is getting in the way for you, actively look for ways to create a reflective space to sort out your own feelings, thoughts, judgment, and biases. Maybe it's seeking out reflective supervision or creating a reflective buffer time right before and right after a session with this particular student. Awareness is definitely an important first step in dealing with internal distractions. And if your own grief is getting in the way, think of ways to honor and process your own grief. Again, seek out reflective supervision. Consider seeking professional support during this particular season when the grieving process is extremely taxing for you. At the end of the day, I invite you to ask yourself, to what extent is grief work a good fit for me? And to what extent is grief work maybe not a good fit for me? This is not to say that from this point on, I'm going to refer all my grieving students to other providers, but really thinking through, how did I see my core values of clinical work embodied in grief work? And are there any of my core values not embodied in grief work? And where my core values are not aligned with the grief work, what can I do to try to resolve the dissonance within me? And what change needs to happen? This is a long reflective process, but I hope that you would consider this a starting point when you will be very reflective about your process. Next slide, please. In the process of supporting a student on their grieving journey, we highlighted 4 important aspects for you in part 1. And we want to present that the 4 aspects may not always go on a linear process. And it definitely involves a lot of circling back and revisiting. We might have to kind of come back. So that's the reason why I have chosen to present them, the 4 aspects, in this picture, where it's sort of like a circular way. I, however, propose that more often than not, because grief can be very jarring, that grief will bring out a stress response within us, sending someone to the lower part of the brainstem, in which it becomes more of like a survival response. And so before one can really process any of the feelings, as well as the thoughts involved, it's often helpful to start with establishing a sense of safety. And when ready, then we'll move up to maybe our midbrain area. It becomes possible for a student to then deal with some of the emotions associated with the loss. And again, we may find ourselves having to come back to establishing safety. But the student then, it's more likely to be able to move to the upper part of the brain, or more of the frontal part, to be able to start making sense of the loss, or as many will call it, meaning making. And when we've kind of gone through some of these other steps, the student can then begin the integrating process. And the integrating process may happen along the way as well, but this is when we're actually trying to help them to think about how to live with the loss beyond the loss. So today we want to touch on the activities and ideas in each of these 4 aspects, what we call sort of like the inaction. And so next slide, please. We're going to turn the time to Alejandra to talk a little bit about establishing safety.
So when we want to establish safety, we refer to being able to make it a safe space in our therapy sessions. Some of the ways that we can do that is by giving permission and normalizing the discussion around death and the ambivalent feelings that come with grief. Sometimes, clients may be careful about what they say to you, or even be scared to use the D word, death, in treatment. So being able to give permission, modeling that we can also use some of that language. We want to be able to be clear as well. And we want to normalize the grief reactions, but acknowledge the uniqueness of the grief. These books right here have been really helpful for me in my practice in treating grief. The first one, I Miss You, goes through the grief journey for this young girl whose grandma dies in the book. And she really goes through the different motions. She feels guilty. She feels also relieved. She also wonders if there may have been things that she could have done to prevent her grandmother's death. So I think that these are all things that can be helpful in normalizing the grief for the children that we work with. And then I know that, Rosalind talked about how our own discomfort in talking about grief. I found that this book, Lifetimes, has been very helpful in really going through the life journey. It gives it different examples about like animals and plants and people. And I picked this passage that I found in the book, but it goes, sometimes living things become ill or they get hurt. Mostly, of course, they get better again, but then there are times when they are so badly hurt or they are so ill that they die because they can no longer stay alive. This can happen when they are young or old or anywhere in between. I think this book is really helpful because it can help really put things into perspective for some of our younger children who are still very much concrete learners, who may wonder like, will I die? What will happen to me? So this can be a helpful example to go through with the children. And when we talk about also normalizing grief reactions and acknowledging the uniqueness of grief, I also want to touch on how we can't necessarily assume that someone's going to have a certain grief reaction based on the relationship with the person they lost. I know that Vanya touched on collective grief, and I can think of, also when we grieve celebrities or important figures. I had one parent who shared that the death by suicide of Chester Bennington from Lincoln Park led to a very, very big emotional reaction for the parent. For weeks, she said that she cried. Even though it happened now years ago, she says that still listening to the songs and by the band still triggers an emotional reaction, so she can't do it. This parent never met the singer, but the music that the singer produced with the group held lots of positive memories for the parent. And it was also impactful in helping the parent go through her own challenges as she was growing up. So we can normalize these types of reactions for families and help them make sense of how they're feeling, and also relieve maybe some of the shame or embarrassment around like, I never met this person, but I really feel a certain way about them. Next slide, please. I wanted to share a case example, a very recent one, with my client B. B and his mother learned that B's teacher died unexpectedly of a heart attack. Unfortunately, this happened at a time when B was getting ready to culminate in his last year. And from just one weekend to the Monday, they found out that his teacher had died unexpectedly. Mom called me and shared the details about it and was very emotional and was worried about the way that B was going to be able to process that in treatment. When we did bring it up to B, he did not want to talk about his teacher at all or even mention the teacher's death. Even though this teacher had been a very important part of the family's lives, the teacher had also worked with other siblings. We spent a lot of time in treatment giving B that permission and be able to talk about his teacher and being able to let him know it was okay to talk about the person with me, to use the word death, because he would whisper it or he would say, you know that thing that happened. And he would also not use his teacher's name. We talked about the symptoms of grief and normalized his experience, and we also focused on helping him remember happy memories and honoring the person that died for him. That way we can normalize for him, or what I did was normalize that it's okay to talk about the person who died, because if we're not, we're also avoiding talking about them altogether, and we're missing some of the happy reminders. So one of the activities that we did is this In My Heart activity. This is an example. But we did drawings and we wrote out some of the memories and things he remembered. So one of the key things that he wrote about in his heart was that he remembered how much his teacher put an emphasis on going to college. So that was something that he really wanted to remember. If we had let the kind of guide treatment in the way that he wanted to, we would have avoided it altogether. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you for talking about how to establish that sense of safety. Then our next aspect in supporting the students in their grief journey is to help them deal with their emotions. And as a quick review, we start with supporting the student in identifying feelings and really highlighting how the grief process may involve many different kinds of feelings. And it's okay to feel sadness and happiness, or even relief or fear, all at the same time. It also involves discovering coping strategies for these feelings, or better yet, maybe ways to regulate our emotions. And in this process, it's also extremely important to respect how the student may be experiencing grief in a very unique way. We spoke about how students, whether they are very young or even our middle school and high school students, may not have the capacity to keep dealing with the emotions for an extended period of time. So pausing is okay. And if they move away from the topic or in their play, it's okay. We can always come back to it as long as we're not reinforcing the avoidance to talk about it. And so that might indicate that there may be a need to go back to the establishing safety and use some of the strategies that Alejandra have mentioned. Next slide, please. So let's talk about inaction. This is where I think a lot of the fun is. I just want to say that most of these ideas you may already know. It is not that much different than when you are trying to support another student in dealing with their emotions. And so you can take whatever you're using and then just adapt it in a way that's conducive in supporting the student and focusing on their emotions surrounding the loss. Let me give you some examples. For identifying feelings, click please. I'm sure that many of us have done this already, but we can do a cutout or a drawing of the body and explore with the consumer where they are feeling different emotions surrounding the loss in their body. If you are working with the parent-child dyad, sometimes I love having the parent actually take a huge piece of paper and have the child lie on the paper and have the parent trace around the body of the child, and then they can select a few different feelings and a few colors to represent that so that they can walk through identifying where they may be feeling these feelings in their bodies. And to highlight the fact that sometimes we feel multiple feelings at the same time in grief, ideas like feeling pie or feeling heart will be the best way. And again, you would ask them to identify several feelings associated with the loss, and then you would select colors representing each. And then you invite them to color in the pie or in the heart. And I shared last time how a child whom I was doing a feeling heart with came up close to me and said, I'm going to color this part of my heart with both the blue representing sadness and the purple representing happiness, because when I think of her, I feel both sad and happy. And she asked, and that's okay, right? That's definitely okay. I also thought of a quick way to just do something a little bit more active for maybe one of your students that needs a little more action. It's called the feeling words on a ball. What you need is just a ball and then a few strips of paper, and you ask the student to identify a few feelings specifically maybe associated with the loss. And then what you do is to tape the feelings on the ball. You will toss it and then catch it. And wherever your thumb lands, that's closest to whatever feeling you ask the student to use the feeling word in a sentence about the person who had died. So these are just some examples. Once again, I think if you have your go-tos, being able to adapt it to talk about feelings surrounding the loss is the best way to do this. Let's think a little bit about coping strategies. Once again, I think you have a lot of tools in your pocket already about this. This is something that you have been doing. The idea is just to focus in ways specifically to cope with feelings associated with the loss. Click, please. Bubbles. I love using bubbles, and especially to demonstrate the difference between a short and shallow breath and then a long and deep breath. And even my middle schoolers or high schoolers or young adults that I've been working with love this. And what we'll do is we'll do like a quick competition about seeing who can blow lots of small bubbles. Now that would involve short and shallow breath, right? And then we want to show the difference by saying, let's see who can get the biggest bubble. And we don't have to do a lot, we just have to see who can get the biggest one. And with that, it involves a long, slower, deep breath. And of course, like when it's telehealth, you can make arrangement with your caregiver so that they have some bubbles on their end and you have some bubbles on your end as well. Another great coping is progressive muscle relaxation. And working with younger students, instead of just walking through the body parts, maybe we can do a more child-friendly version. And I'm trying to look at the time right now. And maybe a little bit later on, if we do have time, we can kind of walk through that together as well, because I notice how, Jamie, definitely I agree with you that it's important to take care of ourselves because we matter too as the provider. And so, of course, sometimes the student you're working with may be ready to sort through their thoughts surrounding the loss, and that's okay. So you move into the next aspect, which is making sense of it. But for some, it may be helpful for them to have some sort of thought-stopping ideas, at least until you are able to support them in building up more tools so that they can kind of go back to their functioning. So some ideas about thought stopping will be the following. One of them is a monster buster, and what it involves is for you to use a small whiteboard on your end to draw the monster. And of course, with telehealth, I ask them to coach me how to draw that monster, or they can draw it on a piece of paper and show me what that looks, and I'll try to copy it onto my whiteboard. And when you have either the scary or worry or the grief monster, I've even done a tantrum monster once, on that whiteboard, then you would need party silly strength. And what you would do is aim those silly strengths, and I call that the monster spray, and I'll aim it on the whiteboard and it sticks to the whiteboard. And what happens then is I will wipe away the silly string on the whiteboard and the monster disappear. You will be really curious about the fact that this works sometimes even with older students as well, just because of like the power of having a sense of control over that. Another example is doing the party hat monster, where you draw the grief monster on paper and you ask them to draw it as scary as possible. Then you can tell the student, now you can do something to change that drawing of the monster. You can make them smaller, you can make them kinder in the face, like what would you do with the eyes to make them kinder? And you can put a party hat on. And that is, once again, the power of being able to change that scary thought and feeling to do a thought stopping right away if there are a lot of very overwhelming things. Then there's the worry bee, which is the lower right corner in your slide. That's when we would cut out the bee shape in black, and you cut the wings in yellow and have stripes in yellow. It takes a little coordinating. If you're doing this telehealth, you may want to drop off some of the supplies after you've cut them out for the parent. Then you ask the child to write the worries in the yellow strips, and you glue them on to the black body, and you would tape a string on the back and tie it to a helium balloon, not Mylar balloon, but helium balloon. And then if you're actually seeing them in person, you can find a place where it's safe to let go of the worries and see the helium balloon with the worries fly away. And if you're doing telehealth, that would be something you can coordinate with the caregiver so that they can do that. And you'll be surprised how kids, even older ones, would be able to really envision their worries flying away. So these are just some ways, if you feel like you have to do a little bit of thought stopping in order for them to continue functioning with their lives. And about respecting how students grieve, it's really about being able to say, I respect that you feel like you have talked about the grief and loss enough for today, and it's okay, with the idea that we will come back to it. So if they move away from the play or if they move away from talking about it, it's okay. So one idea to allow that to happen naturally, it's called a garbage bag or garbage can. We will tell the student, what garbage is, right? And then things that they don't want. And these are things that if you leave it in for too long, it becomes kind of stinky. And that's what some of the feelings are like if we don't talk about them and leave them there. Then why don't we just write down these things, either feelings or thoughts you have about your person's death, and that really bothers you sometimes. And what we'll do is I'll put them on these little pieces of paper and I'll put them in the garbage bag. With telehealth, you can have them draw it on a piece of paper and show you, and then you can put it in your garbage bag. Now that we're done, I'm going to tape it shut and we won't open it until the next time. And every time when we see each other, we're going to take like maybe one piece out and we'll try to play it out, or we can try to talk it out and talk through it. Next slide, please. Then we move further up to the thinking part of the brain and support a student in making sense of the loss. A quick review, this involves identifying and reprocessing thought distortion surrounding the loss, also talking about and coming up with plans to get the student's needs met, and preparing for hard days, which more often than not involves collaboration with others in the student's life. Next slide, please. And to identify and reprocess or restructure distorted thoughts, this is once again not different than what you would do otherwise in your therapeutic service with the student. The CBT techniques are the same, and expect that you may be dealing with some distortions that are unique to grief though. Tools to be used include the cognitive triangle, responsibility pie, putting a thought on trial, maybe helpful versus unhelpful, and true versus untrue thoughts, and definitely Socratic questioning. Now, one case example that I would mention that I think capture grief specific distortion well was when I had a 7-year-old client of mine that continued to believe that she was the reason why mom died. She was 3 years old when mom died, and she thought that it was because she did not remind her mom to take her medication that day. We spoke about how it is rather common that children and youths may think that they may be related to the cause of the death, just because of the nature of grief and also their developmental process. Once we have been able to identify this thought, she had about her mom's death, and of course, like tons of praise, because it has taken a little bit of time for her to be able to verbalize this to me. I knew that I would need to help her realize that she was 3 years old at that time and she was not responsible. So I used a common strategy in cognitive restructuring called best friend scenario, although it was slightly different because it involves not her best friend per se, but I asked her if she knows anyone that is 3 years old. And she said, yes, my little cousin's 3 years old. And I asked her more about him. And she told me his name. And then I asked her to tell me what he's like and what she likes to play with him. So she started to tell me a little bit more about this cousin of hers. And then I asked her, what he's capable of. Can he do this? Can he do that? Can he go on slides on by himself? Can he go on the swings by himself? And then I asked her if she wants to make sure that she doesn't forget to do something, like brushing her teeth before bed, whether she will ask her little cousin to remind her. And she said, no, he's just a baby. And she picked that word and she's like, he's just a baby. To her, that's 7 years old. She thought like the 3-year-old was a baby. And he said, he won't remember and he's too little. And I said, no, really? Why not? And she said, I have to remember to brush my teeth if I want good teeth. He just laughs and runs around. He's just kind of playing around. He won't remember. And I said, I wonder whether you will like that when you were 3 years old. You were a little baby laughing and running around and you won't remember. And she said, exactly. And I asked, what if grandma has to take some medicine? Do you think your little cousin would remember to tell her to take the medicine? And she said, of course not. Even I don't remember to do that. And I'm 7 years old now. And grandma has to remember it herself. And I said, well, let's say that your little cousin did not remind your grandma to take the medicine. And your grandma said, oh no, I forgot. Do you think it's his fault? And she said, no. And I said, then I wonder if it really was your fault to remind your mom, or your responsibility to remind your mom to take the medicine, and you were 3. I think it definitely takes us a little time in order for us to talk more and think through. The process also involves a little bit more time for us to be able to help her think through what may be thoughts that are not very helpful for her. But that's how we try to help them make sense of it. Making sense of the loss also involves talking about how the student can get their needs met, especially if they're younger. And their level of needs may look very different depending on the age. And so we often use a before and after picture just to highlight how things are different. And Vanya will talk a little bit more about like other ways to make the connection, but it's important to start thinking about the following. If the student's young, have conversations about who then can come and take care of them. And talking about maybe secondary losses as well. With my dad's death, I'm not involved in soccer anymore because he used to go to practices with me. Then we think through, is there someone that can be there for you for your soccer practice? Or now that my grandma died, I'm not going to my grandparents' house anymore. And we touch on that a little bit back in September. What can we do to maintain the connection with grandpa then? Because I haven't been there. Can we do, instead of sleepover at grandparents, maybe like shorter tea parties with grandpa? Making sense of the loss include getting ready and feeling prepared for hard days as well. And of course, we know anniversaries of death are usually very, very hard. Sometimes for like celebrations, like birthdays, holidays, about award ceremonies. My grandma or my parent who died, it's not here to see my graduation. Thinking of ways to create a coping box may be helpful. I have a 13-year-old client that found a tin box, and in it, he just put like different things in there. He put a piece of rock because in our process, we found that touching the smooth surface on that rock really helped him. And he also put like a small container of silly putty in there and a small notebook and a pencil. That's all that was in his coping box. But he also put a picture of his grandpa in there, and that's his coping box. And he took this with him to Thanksgiving dinner at an uncle's house just in case that he needed it. And again, this involves collaboration with others in the student's life. And we'll definitely talk a little bit more about involving caregivers. I'm seeing some of the questions there. When we get to the Q&A, we'll definitely love to be able to answer that. Next slide, please. So Vanya, talk a little bit about the next aspect.
Yes. So part of what we are doing are facilitating the client staying connected, remembering their loved one, and envisioning life without the person. So one of the examples of an activity that you can do is an exercise where you draw balloons in hand and balloons that are floating in the air. The balloons in hand are things that you can hold on to. So things maybe like a physical object from their loved one, hold on to going to their house if that's still available for them, reading old cards that maybe were written to them from their loved one. And those are things that they can hold on to. The balloon in the air are things that they can remember. So things that aren't in their life anymore, but things that they can still remember, and like their cooking, the way they used to tell jokes, their hugs, and they can write that out. And this exercise helps them feel connected, remember their loved ones. Afterwards, you can talk to them about how they imagine things will be different now. So now that there's these things that they're not able to hold on to, how is their life looking differently? Through telehealth, instead of it being, where you're drawing it out with them there, maybe you could share your screen with the image already drawn out and type in what they state. Maybe just ask them to draw it on their end, like on a sketchbook, and then they would show and share with you what they had drawn and written. Next slide. Okay, so here are some more examples of some activities that can help with staying connected, remembering, and envisioning life without the person. One of the ones that I've talked about before were the nichos that I made. I actually made some, as you can see on the screen, is those are my grandparents that I had made nichos for. I also made a blank one for one of my clients. So what we did was this person that I actually have to see in person. And this client, I brought the paints. She was able to paint her own nicho. I printed out a picture of her grandmother, was able to put that in for her. She was able to talk about what made her grandmother special. What did she miss about her? What did her grandmother like? What was her favorite color? And just have a lot of these conversations during the activity. So that was something that was really helpful for her. She was able to talk about her grandmother and share a lot of her experiences during that activity. For telehealth, one of the things you can do is create a blank nicho if you wanted to drop it off at their house for them to decorate, or you can have it on your end and then they would tell you what color, what design, what did they like, and then when you're done with it, you can send it to their house too. I made them out of wood. It could be made out of cardboard as well. Another one is a box of memory chocolates. So that's on the bottom right corner of the screen. For that one, it's getting a chocolate box, creating different memories in each of the liners, or getting tiny cupcake liners and have them draw memories or words, symbols on paper, cut them out and glue them into the liners. That way they can use that as a memory box. They can open it up, look into the box, and look over the memories that they had of their loved ones. Another thing that I had done with a client was storytelling art. And this was to help her process her grandmother's funeral. So she went to the funeral. So after that, what we did was draw it out on a paper. What did the funeral look like? And she was able to explain to me like how the funeral went versus if we were just talking straight face to face. Here she was able to focus on her drawing. So she was able to talk a lot more than if I had just asked her directly. So here I'm asking her directly while she's doing the activity. She was able to talk about how she felt and what she looked like, what the whole thing felt like, who was there. In telehealth, you could do the same thing where they would have the sketchbook on their end and they can just show it to you and you can have that discussion, facilitate the discussion. What you could also do is what I like to do when I ask clients to draw is I'll have a sketchbook on my end too, where I'm also drawing. It could be something related. So that way they don't feel like you're watching them while they're just drawing. Another thing is storytelling. You could pretend you're a radio host. The topic of the day is when someone you love died, and the client is the expert on the show. You would have the client tell you their experience and pretend that people are calling in with questions and asking for advice for other people who went through the same experience. So in that way, you can have that kind of conversation. They can feel like they're an expert in their own experience. And they could even talk about have self-efficacy in what worked for me, what might work for other people, what can I recognize that was something positive that I did that helped make me feel okay. And finally, there is a in memory of activity, and that's the drawing that you can see with the hands that are shaped in a flower. So what they would do was trace one hand on one color construction paper, trace the other hand on a different color construction paper, cut them out. On the palm of the right hand, write a memory of the person who had died. On each of the fingers of the right hand, write a feeling that they have when they think of that memory. Then on the left palm, write how things have changed since that memory. So on the fingers of that hand, you would write your feelings about what has changed. So this makes that connection of memory, but also looking into the future, like what is different now? Like how is my life different since my loved one has died? And it helps them envision life in the future. Next slide.
And we'll invite Alejandra to talk a little bit about collaborating with caregivers.
Thank you. So caregivers are a really, really important part of our grief work. I would argue that it's just as important as the grief work that we are doing with the child or the student. In working with caregivers, we can establish a narrative or an understanding about what happened and what the loved one meant to the child. We want to have the best picture that we can about what the child knows. Sometimes the parent or the caregiver would tell us like that the child doesn't know what happened or does not have the details. And this could be especially hard when the circumstances around a death may be difficult or uncomfortable to talk about for the family, such as an accident, a suicide, or an overdose. So we want to work with caregivers to know this information and know what the child knows. And then we also want to make sense of the relationship. Maybe the child did not know this person, but sees others' grief reactions and then gets triggered themselves. We also want to be able to work with the caregivers to integrate the family's beliefs, their religious practices, their customs and experiences around death. We want the family to share with us, do they hold funerals? What do they think about death? Is there a special religious practice that is incorporated? And then we also want to clarify that this should not substitute um, the use of the D word, death. So families can still talk about, the person that this person died. In our family, we believe blank happens after someone dies. We want to avoid just using euphemisms like, they're in a better place or they're always watching over you or in heaven. We want to still use the D word, but also incorporate it into the family's religious beliefs. We want to help the family to work together in working through the uncomfortable by normalizing the different grief responses. Sometimes caregivers may be afraid of their own emotional reactions when talking about death. They might say, like, but what if I cry? Or what if what if it's too much for me? So we can give that permission to the caregivers and family members to work through those difficult emotions and not hide them. And then this is something that we definitely want to do in preparation to have like a family session or a joint session. We want to be able to give that caregiver the space aside from our session with the child, so we can really talk about this and let the caregiver experience those emotions in a safe place. We can model with the caregiver for children that it's okay to talk about and process our feelings with somebody that we trust and will honor our feelings. And then we can also prepare the caregivers for managing their expectations about how a child may react, and to not be surprised by the varying range of grief reactions. Sometimes some caregivers may say like, oh, so-and-so, it seemed like it didn't even matter. And to be able to even talk about even avoidance or distraction as a grief reaction for the child. Um, we want to be able to remember the loved one, including 2 different interventions, both of which I've used before. The Good in Us activity is doing like a writing or drawing about positive qualities or strengths shared with the person who died. In the example from earlier with B, the focus on education and being a good student was something that he shared with his teacher. So being able to talk about how that is something that he will remember about his teacher as long after the experience. And then the safety star. This is a way for the child to think about and articulate the adults or safe people that they can talk about their grief experience with. This is something that we can work with the caregivers on preparing them and asking them about who might be able to really react in a way that's honoring the child's experience if they are remembering the person who died. That way the child may not, necessarily go to a person who may, tell them, oh, stop making a big deal, or, whatever reaction they may have. This will just be a specific, group that the child may come to, and will be ready to hear the child if they want to remember a special memory or even want to share a feeling that might come up with the loved one. And what's really fun with the safety star is they can definitely be really creative with it, and you can choose what medium you want to use with it, whether it's on paper or like in a box or something. But it's just about being able to have the child and the caregiver visualize who can help support the child as they remember the loved one. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Alejandra, for sharing about working with the caregivers. Now, these are some additional resources. There are definitely a lot of great resources out there. I know that there is a question about whether some of these techniques can be found in other, like a manual or anything like that. These are actually from various sources, so I think that will be helpful for us to point you to some of the resources as well as some maybe books that we have used. Definitely on Sesame Street in communities, there are a lot of great activities you can do. There are videos, there are also articles for parents as well. Do explore that because there's a lot of great interactive activities that are there. Our House Grief Support Center, who will be presenting, I think, tomorrow too, definitely has a lot of great resources as well. I think a couple of the ideas came from trainings with them. Definitely there are a lot of great resources out there, as well as the Dougie Center. And we've included the reference for an article for educators that was written by one of the developers of TFCBT. And hopefully the books listed here will be helpful. We will also have a resource list later that you would be able to have and access with the PowerPoint as well. Next slide, please. So some of the references I just want to highlight for you definitely include Dr. Heidi Caddison has 101 favorite play therapy techniques. The book itself does not include all the ones that we have covered, but some of them, it's actually in this book as well. We've just kind of taken it and adapted a little bit into more of like a grief situation. And so you'll be able to find some of the ideas there, and we just wanted to list some of the other references that we have talked about here today. So next slide, please. So I'm going to turn the time to you, Mindy, so that we can start our Q&A time.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rosalind and Vanya and Alejandra. We so appreciate you sharing your expertise and all of the resources and strategies. We have several questions in the Q&A pod, so I will let Dr. Britt Liebsack lead us through our Q&A portion today.
Great. Yes, we've had some great questions come in. Vanya spoke to this some early on in the presentation, but what are recommendations if rather than being concerned about what if they cry, you're concerned about what if I cry when you're meeting with a student?
Yes, that's definitely one of the things that I struggled with, because I feel like I'm very highly empathetic as well. And then when it touches on something that that I have felt, it kind of awakens it. So that's definitely the thing where when you know that something is affecting you, it's really taking the time to honor that and taking the time to work through that, because otherwise you might get triggered a little too much during session. So when it comes with death, or if I start to notice I'm uncomfortable about something, then I'm why am I uncomfortable with that? I'll take a moment for myself to try to figure that out so that I can be not reactive in session.
Thank you. All right, another question was, can these techniques be used for losses other than death? For example, with students that have a parent who will be in prison for life.
So let me try to start with that, and I'll invite Vanya and Alejandra to add to this too. I definitely think that a lot of these techniques can be adapted and adjusted based on the type of loss that the student has experienced. So for example, instead of focusing on the before and after from a death, it may be the before and after from when the parent is in prison. So what are things looking like now? We can definitely talk about feelings associated with the parent's incarceration. Same thing for if it's like a divorce. In fact, I love doing the before and after picture with divorces, because that definitely that opens up the door for us to talk a lot about what was and what we're seeing right now, and be able to kind of process the differences and all the techniques about processing feelings and emotions. We just have to do a slight change in terms of, when you're thinking about maybe dad who's not living in the house right now, or thinking about what things used to be before your mom and dad separated. So definitely they can be adapted. So thank you for bringing that up, because I think that it's very important to know that all of these techniques can really be tweaked into working with all types of losses as well. Alejandra and Vanya, anything to add to that?
I was just going to say that about the same thing. It can definitely be adapted for that. And I like the example. I was going to give a similar example that Rosalind gave, where you draw a picture of how things are now. You can even do one about like, how do you want things to be? And then talk about like the difference between that. But pretty much, yeah, use your creativity with any of those interventions and adapt them to any loss.
Yeah, so same thing as Vanya and Rosalind mentioned, I'm echoing. These could be very easily adapted, and a lot of the work can be done as well with the caregivers to kind of understand the narrative around the divorce or the incarceration, et cetera, so that we can really work together to help the child process the feelings that come with this major change. Because we don't want to assume that because the child is a certain age that it won't affect them. So we want to be able to give the space in our sessions and in our treatment to honor that.
Thank you so much. Another question is, when we're helping students grieve and a student has multiple losses, do we try and focus on one of their losses at a time or make it collective?
That's definitely a wonderful question. I think we kind of touched on that a little bit the last time in terms of having multiple losses. The way that I see it a lot of times is it really depends on how the student it's being impacted the most. One analogy that I love to use is definitely being able to kind of think about how there are a lot of common themes with the multiple losses. Doesn't necessarily mean that we have to touch on every single loss in the student's life, but being able to offer that opportunity to talk about how this is similar or different than maybe a previous loss. And the way that I see it always is almost like if you look at a forest, there are definitely many different trees, right? And I learned this from one of the TSCBT trainers, definitely looking at multiple trauma. Same thing for multiple losses. When you're looking at a forest with many different trees, you can actually just try to talk about the whole forest, but that might be very overwhelming. And so maybe what we can do is together we can decide which tree we're going to look at first. And let's just kind of look at this tree. And in the process, we may find that this tree has a lot of similarities with the tree that's next to it, or maybe the tree that's over there, right? And you want to be able to make those connections, but because of how multiple losses can be very overwhelming, I like to use that analogy and say, it's really in your hands because this is your process. Why don't you tell me where you would like to start? And of course, we can always do timelines as well to help them identify which would be the most important thing. But from a treatment planning perspective, of course, we want to look at which loss is bringing about the most, I guess, the highest level of impairments, right? So if we know that it's impacting their functioning, and this is like the loss that it's having the biggest impact, that may be where we're going to start with that. Alejandra, anything to add to that?
No, I think you covered the points pretty well and being able to articulate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Britt.
Another question that someone had was, what if the child does not want to talk about grief, but is in treatment as required by DCFS or somewhere else?
Yes, because a lot of times we do have that happening to us when it is sort of like a requirement that they are. I think it definitely involves the first aspect that we were talking about, right? In terms of whether we can establish a sense of safety, that makes it a little bit easier for them to talk about it. But also in the process, just kind of respecting that the way that they need to process it may be very different. Maybe if they're not able to talk about it, are there other ways that we'll be able to kind of touch on those memories a little bit more? Is it possible through art, or is it possible through play even? And I'm talking about play even for older students. And I've seen older students play out some of their losses with a dollhouse when they didn't think that they wanted to do it. But when you make that available for them, they ended up being able to really process their grief and loss a lot more than with words. So it really depends on the student, I feel like. But once again, I just want to lean on my team right now. Any other thoughts from Alejandra
Yeah,
and
so
Vanya?
I wanted to add that no reaction or avoidance is a reaction. So being able to give a space to that and talking about it, whether it's, being open in the session and saying like, it seems like this is not something that you want to talk about. I wonder why that is. And maybe the child may not be able to articulate that they feel like they're going to be, a puddle of tears, or that they get a knot in their stomach whenever they talk about the grief. So being able to work that with that avoidance through not just, talking, and like Rosalind suggested, in being able to provide different mediums to work through it can be really helpful. But avoidance is still a reaction or a grief response. So honoring that and remembering that is key.
Thank you so much. Another question, somewhat related, is how might you work with students from like a culture where death is not to be discussed because it is taboo?
I think that definitely can be maybe answered by Alejandra and Vania too, because they both probably have experience where there are a lot of barriers. I think it's definitely wanting to be able to do some psychoeducation for the parents to understand why it may be helpful for them, but at the end of the day, they're still the caregiver, and we want to be able to respect that. And so I like what Alejandra was saying a little bit earlier too, in terms of how we can say, we say this person died. And with that, I'm sure that there was a lot of psychoeducation to help the parent get to a place where they understand why it may be important to talk about the death. And I've found that using a lot of analogy sometimes help them understand why we want to be able to talk about it, and then also giving them that power to be able to say, but in a family, this is our tradition, and in our family, these are our religious beliefs. So Alejandra, I'm going to turn it to you, and Vanya, feel free to jump in to add to that too.
Yeah, I absolutely think it's important to honor the family's wishes and their culture. We don't want to assume that they're just going to be very comfortable talking about death, knowing that that it can be taboo. But we definitely don't want to shy away or assume that because we know that they're part of a certain culture or religion or anything, that they're not going to want to talk about it. And then also really putting it into key, as Rosalind mentioned, about doing the psychoed about why it would be beneficial, especially with children, depending on their age. They may be concrete thinkers, so they need that specificity in the vocabulary about what it means when you're dead. It means that you don't eat anymore. It means that you're not, awake. And for them to really understand it and use that language. So and so died, and in our family we believe blank happens after somebody dies. It may be that, in our family we don't talk about that person anymore. So what might be other ways that this person may be able to remember or, still process their grief in a way that's still honoring their culture or their religious practices.
Yeah, I agree with Alejandra and Roslyn. You're honoring what the family wants, but if there is like some way to get some buy-in, like for example, if the client is like crying a lot and the mother or the father is thinking like, oh, my son or daughter is just really upset, then that can be an opening, like, maybe it might be helpful if he talked about it with me. I could be a safe place for him to talk to about it. And that can be a way to get some buy-in, but if they're noticing like some symptoms that they wish was not the case.
Thank you all. Speaking of honoring the family's wishes and comfort having these difficult conversations, what's the best way that you have found in guiding caregivers on how to have the dialogue regarding difficult deaths, such as suicide, overdose, or homicide, when caregivers have difficulty talking with their children about how a person died?
Thank you so much for that question. And I think that's probably the hardest part of being able to support someone through a death or the grief journey is definitely when the death is a difficult death. I actually know of quite a lot of resources that are out there that will support us to have those conversations. But at the end of the day, I think it always comes back to being able to help them see maybe the rationale behind the reason why we want to be able to talk about it. In fact, I think that part of my training is in childhood traumatic grief. It's definitely relating more to being able to kind of see those traumatic reactions. So it goes a little bit deeper than just like a bereavement. And because when the grief involves a little bit more of like a trauma part to it, I think that it's not like you need to necessarily have the expertise to be able to say like, hey, this is how you say it, but it's more of us being able to say, I'm on this with you. Let's try to kind of get to know what your child is like and what do you think will be the most helpful. These are the reasons why I think it would be important to tell them what suicide is, or these are the important reasons why I think it's important to explain that the uncle was murdered versus, that they died naturally. But it's definitely being able to involve the caregivers in that discussion and saying, how can we support you? And these are the words that we are going to use with your child. And these are the reasons why we're choosing to say suicide or that we're using the word death, and for them to be able to understand where we're coming from. But the fact that we are here on this journey with you, what can we do to support you? So anything to add to that, Alejandra and Vanya?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to share too, just with the resources. I know it was listed on one of the slides, but when talking about like these difficult topics, even with younger children, Sesame Street in Communities is such a great resource. They recently released just like a whole section on addiction. So being also able to talk about, maybe when a death is related to an overdose and talking about addiction with children in a way that is age appropriate, and also helping the family understand why it may be important to talk to their 4- or 5-year-old about the death and the way that it happened. Because sometimes they might say, oh, they were sick or, something like that. And then when the child gets sick, maybe they might wonder, am I going to die? So being able to kind of distinguish and use appropriate language based on where the child is at is really helpful. And I found that in my work, particularly with the birth to 5 range, Sesame Street has been so awesome with some of those resources to share with caregivers. There's different videos, there's books, there's coloring pages, there's a lot of things that can be integrated, not just in our sessions, but for the caregivers to do on their own as outside of our sessions.
Thank you so much all for answering our questions. There are some really great questions we were not able to get to yet, and so I'm so sorry about that, but I'm going to pass it back over to Dr. Chadwell, and Dr. West put in the chat if you have follow-up questions or if we were not able to get to your question, an email address to send that to.
And actually, any questions that we weren't able to get to, I know we had a frequently asked questions form that we filled out during the first institute. So we can actually address those in an FAQ document that will get posted with our slides and our video today. So that'll be available on the website in about 2 weeks. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you again to our wonderful presenters and for our time together today. I'm going to launch one more poll for us to close out the session. If you could fill this out. And actually, as you're reading that, if you could go to the next slide, please. There's some contact information for Rosalind Kwong. And thank you again for your time today.